It feels like every time you turn on the news, there's another conflict making headlines. And it is so easy to feel like we're just living in a lawless world. But you know what? There is a rule book, a set of international laws designed to govern war itself. In this explainer, we're going to break down what those rules actually are and ask the big question, do they still even matter?
It's a huge question, right? And it deserves a real answer. I mean, when we see what's happening on the ground, it's totally understandable to get cynical and wonder if these so-called rules of war are anything more than just a nice idea. So here's how we're going to tackle it. First, we're going to get to know the rulebook itself. What are the basic, fundamental laws of war? Then we're going to put those laws to the test. We'll apply them to 3 major conflicts that are happening right now. And finally, we're going to get to the toughest part, enforcement. What happens when the rules get broken? Does this system have any actual teeth?
Okay, so before we can talk about how rules are broken, we obviously need to understand what the rules are in the first place. So let's lay the groundwork. International law isn't one giant book you can just pull off a shelf. It's way more like a library, built from a bunch of different sources over many, many years. For what we're talking about today, the most important ones are the big treaties and conventions, things like the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions. These are the formal written-down agreements where countries actually commit to a shared set of rules.
Now, this right here gets to the very first question in any war. Was it even legal to start it? The UN Charter is pretty crystal clear on this. Using force against another country is illegal, period. But, and this is a huge but, it carves out 2 critical exceptions: if you're acting in self-defense or if you get the green light from the UN Security Council. Pretty much every conflict you see in the news starts with a massive, fierce debate over these 2 exceptions.
But the moment the fighting begins, the whole legal framework shifts. The question is no longer if the war is legal, but how it's being fought. And this is where something called international humanitarian law, or IHL, takes over. Its main goal? To limit human suffering. The first, and honestly the most critical principle of IHL, is distinction. The line is supposed to be bright and clear. Armies have to distinguish between fighters and civilians at all times. Intentionally targeting civilians is illegal, full stop. This is the absolute cornerstone of the entire system. Next up is proportionality, and this one is so important because it's so often misunderstood. It does not mean an eye for an eye. It's a forward-looking balancing act. So before any attack, commanders have to weigh the expected military gain against the potential harm to civilians. If that harm to civilians is going to be excessive compared to the military advantage, the attack is illegal.
Then we have military necessity. Think of this principle as a brake on just random destruction. It basically says that any force you use has to be necessary to achieve a specific, legitimate military goal. It rules out pointless or purely vindictive acts of destruction. And finally, there's the principle of humanity. This is the rule that forbids causing suffering or injury that isn't needed to accomplish a military purpose. It bans weapons and tactics that are just inherently cruel. So, together, these 4 ideas, distinction, proportionality, necessity, and humanity, they form the core of how wars are supposed to be fought.
All right, so we've got the rulebook. Now let's see how these principles actually hold up in the real world. We're going to apply them to 3 major conflicts that you see in the headlines all the time.
First up, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Legally speaking, this is widely seen as a textbook violation of that core principle in the UN Charter we talked about. You just can't use force against the sovereignty of another state.
And in response, you can literally see the gears of international law starting to turn. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for alleged war crimes. So what does that actually mean? It means if he travels to any of the 124 countries that are members of that court, they are legally required to arrest him. On top of that, a separate special tribunal has been set up just to prosecute the crime of aggression itself.
Okay, now let's turn to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. A really crucial legal point here is that international humanitarian law applies equally to everyone in a conflict. That means state armies and non-state armed groups like Hamas. The rules of distinction and proportionality, they're binding on everyone, no exceptions.
So here, we see a few different legal avenues being pursued all at once. You've got UN-backed inquiries looking into alleged war crimes by both sides. And then, separately, South Africa has brought a case against Israel to the International Court of Justice. That's the UN's top court for disputes between states, accusing it of violating the Genocide Convention. That case is about state responsibility, which is a totally different legal track from charging individuals with crime.
And finally, let's take a look at the conflict in Yemen. Now, this is a super complex civil war with a lot of foreign intervention, but those core legal principles of IHL, protecting civilians, they still apply to every single party involved.
The conflict in Yemen really tests the laws in some different ways. For example, IHL explicitly prohibits using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Well, that raises some profound legal questions about tactics like blockades that stop food and medicine from getting through. It also forces a really hard look at international arms sales, asking whether countries that sell weapons to factions in a conflict could actually be legally complicit in any war crimes committed with those weapons.
So we have the rules, and we see all these allegations of those rules being broken, which brings us to the giant paradox, the elephant in the room of international law. Who actually enforces it? And this right here is the system's greatest challenge. There is no global police force to go arrest a head of state or to stop an army in its tracks. The UN Security Council, which is the one body designed to authorize action, can be completely paralyzed by the veto power of just one of its 5 permanent members. In the end, enforcement relies almost entirely on the political will of other countries to act, and that will is often in very, very short supply.
Given that huge enforcement gap, it's totally fair to ask our original question again. If the rules can be broken and it seems like there are no consequences, why does the system matter at all?
Because even a flawed framework is infinitely better than no framework at all. International law gives us a universal language to condemn atrocities and a legal yardstick to judge actions. It provides the basis for sanctions, it shapes global opinion, and it can totally delegitimize a war effort. And maybe most importantly, it creates a historical record, a foundation for justice that can be built on for years, sometimes long after the fighting finally stops.
And really, that's the bottom line here. International law might not have the power to stop every war before it starts, but it provides a critical, essential standard for how that war is fought. It exists to protect the vulnerable, to hold the powerful to account, and to offer a path toward justice, no matter how long or difficult that path might be. Without these rules, the battlefield would be an even more brutal place.